Welcome to SleepLore, where the echoes of the past meet the stillness of the night. Tonight, we journey back to a time when the world was measured by the stride of a legionnaire and the reach of a marble pillar. Before you close your eyes, let us walk through the gates of a city that refused to be forgotten. From a single spark on a riverside to an empire that set the horizon on fire, this is the rise, the glory, and the eventual fading of Rome. Settle in, clear your mind, and let the history of the eternal city carry you away. The story begins not with emperors, but with a legend. The story of Rome does not begin with marble columns or vast legions, but with the quiet flow of a river and the shifting shadows of central Italy's wooded hills. To understand the gravity of what would become the greatest empire of the ancient world, we must first look to the landscape of the 8th century before the Common Era. Italy was then a mosaic of cultures, the Etruscans to the north, the Greeks to the south, and in the center, a rugged collection of Latin-speaking tribes. Among these hills, near a bend in the river Tiber, a small settlement would take root, though its origins are draped heavily in the veil of legend. The Romans themselves believed their lineage stretched back to the ruins of Troy. They told of Aeneas, a hero who fled the burning city and crossed the Mediterranean to find a new home in the land of Latium. His descendants, it was said, ruled the city of Alba Longa for generations. It is here that the mythic history of Rome truly begins, with a conflict of blood and power. The king of Alba Longa, Numitor, was deposed by his brother Amulius, who sought to secure his stolen throne by forcing Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin. This was intended to ensure she would never bear an heir. Yet, as the story goes, she was visited by Mars, the god of war, and gave birth to twin sons, Romulus and Remus. Amulius, fearing the destiny of these children, ordered them cast into the Tiber. But the river was in flood, and the basket containing the infants was caught in the roots of a fig tree at the base of the Palatine Hill. Here, the myth takes a turn into the primal. A she-wolf, drawn by the cries of the hungry infants, did not devour them, but instead provided them with her own milk. This image, the wolf and the twins, would become the eternal symbol of the Roman spirit, a mixture of wild, predatory strength and divine protection. Eventually, the twins were discovered by a shepherd named Faustulus, who raised them in the simplicity of the hills. As they grew to manhood, their true identity was revealed, and they returned to Alba Longa to restore their grandfather to his throne. But the twins were not content to remain in the shadows of the old city. They returned to the place of their rescue, the banks of the Tiber, to found a city of their own. The founding of Rome, traditionally dated to April 21st, 753 BCE, was marked by a tragic fracture between brothers. They could not agree on which hill the city should be built upon. Romulus chose the Palatine Hill, while Remus favored the Aventine. They turned to the gods for a sign, practicing the art of augury, the interpretation of the flight of birds. Remus saw 6 vultures first, but Romulus saw 12. The resulting dispute ended in violence. Romulus began to dig the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of his city, and when Remus mockingly leaped over the low wall to show its weakness, Romulus struck him down. It was a cold, defining moment. Rome was born not in peace, but in fratricide, a city built on the belief that its boundaries were sacred and its laws absolute. Romulus became the first of the 7 legendary kings. He was the architect of Rome's earliest social structures, dividing the people into those who could fight and those who could advise. He established the first 100 senators, whom he called the patres, or fathers, the ancestors of the patrician class that would dominate Roman politics for centuries. Yet, the new city lacked one vital component for its survival: women. To solve this, Romulus turned to the neighboring Sabine tribes. Under the guise of a festival, the Romans seized the Sabine women, leading to a war that was only halted when the women themselves intervened, stepping between their fathers and their new husbands to plead for peace. This union between the Romans and the Sabines shaped the character of the early kingdom. It was a fusion of peoples, a recurring theme in Roman history where the conquered were often integrated rather than merely subdued. Upon the death of Romulus, who, according to legend, was taken up to heaven in a storm to become the god Quirinus, the throne did not pass to a warrior, but to a man of peace. Numa Pompilius, the second king, was a Sabine chosen for his wisdom and piety. If Romulus gave Rome its walls and its military heart, Numa gave Rome its soul. His reign was long and marked by a total absence of war. He is credited with establishing the religious foundations of the state, including the office of the Pontifex Maximus and the College of the Vestal Virgins. He organized the Roman calendar, adding the months of January and February to align the lunar year with the solar cycles. And he built the Temple of Janus, whose doors remained open during war and closed during peace. Throughout his long reign, those doors remained firmly shut. The silence within the Temple of Janus was not to last forever, for the peace of Numa Pompilius was an era defined by its rarity rather than its permanence. When the second king of Rome finally passed, leaving behind a city structured by law and sanctified by ritual, the Roman people felt the weight of a growing population and the pressure of neighboring tribes who had grown wary of this rising power on the Tiber. The man chosen to succeed Numa was Tullus Hostilius, a figure who stood in stark contrast to his predecessor. Tullus was a man of fire and iron, a grandson of a hero who had fought alongside Romulus himself. He believed that the peace of Numa had made the Romans soft, and that the survival of the city depended upon its ability to dominate the landscape through force. Tullus Hostilius turned his gaze toward Alba Longa, the ancient city that was the traditional mother of Rome. The relationship between the two cities had grown strained, characterized by cattle raids and petty disputes along their shared borders. For Tullus, these were not merely nuisances to be settled by diplomacy, but opportunities for conquest. The war that followed was not one of massive armies clashing in the open field, but a conflict defined by a singular, legendary duel that would be remembered for 1,000 years. To avoid a protracted and bloody war between two peoples who shared a common ancestry, it was agreed that the fate of both cities would be decided by a contest of champions. Rome chose the Horatii, 3 brothers of immense skill, while Alba Longa chose the Curiatii, another set of 3 brothers. The battle took place in the neutral ground between the two armies, a slow and agonizing encounter that mirrored the tension of the era. Early in the fight, 2 of the Roman Horatii were killed, leaving the 3rd brother alone against the 3 Curiatii, who were themselves wounded but still standing. The surviving Roman brother, realizing he could not face all 3 at once, began to run. It seemed to the onlookers like an act of cowardice, but it was a calculated maneuver. As the wounded Curiatii pursued him, they became separated by their varying speeds. One by one, the Roman turned and cut them down in their isolation. With the death of the final Curiatius, Alba Longa fell under Roman shadow. However, Tullus Hostilius was not a merciful victor. When the leader of Alba Longa later attempted to betray Rome during a battle against the Etruscans, Tullus ordered the city razed to the ground. The ancient temples were spared, but the homes and walls were leveled, and the entire population of Alba Longa was forcibly moved to Rome, doubling the city's size and populating the Cælian hill. Tullus expanded the Senate to include the leading families of the conquered city, establishing the Curia Hostilia as a meeting place for this new, integrated aristocracy. Yet, his reign ended in shadow. Legend says that his neglect of the gods led to a plague that swept through the city, and in a desperate, failed attempt to perform a ritual to Jupiter, he was struck down by a bolt of lightning that consumed his palace. The Romans, perhaps weary of the constant warfare and the divine displeasure of the previous reign, turned to Ancus Marcius, the grandson of the peaceful Numa. Ancus sought to find a middle path, a balance between the martial vigor of Tullus and the religious devotion of Numa. He re-established the public religious ceremonies that had been neglected, but he was also a pragmatist. Under his rule, Rome began to look toward the sea. He extended Roman territory to the coast, founding the colony of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber, ensuring that the city would have a direct link to the trade routes of the Mediterranean. To better defend the city, he fortified the Janiculum Hill on the western bank of the river and connected it to the city with the first wooden bridge, the Pons Sublicius. This bridge was a marvel of early engineering, constructed entirely without iron nails so that it could be quickly dismantled in the event of an invasion. It was during the reign of Ancus Marcius that a newcomer arrived in Rome, a man whose presence signaled the beginning of a profound cultural shift. Lucumo, a wealthy and ambitious man from the Etruscan city of Tarquinia, moved to Rome with his wife Tanaquil. In the fluid social structure of early Rome, Lucumo found the opportunity that had been denied to him in the more rigid Etruscan society. He changed his name to Lucius Tarquinius Priscus and used his vast wealth and silver-tongued diplomacy to become a trusted advisor to King Ancus. When the king died, Tarquinius bypassed the king's young sons and convinced the people to elect him as the first Etruscan king of Rome. The smoke of the Gallic fires eventually cleared, leaving behind a city that was physically scarred but spiritually hardened. The sack of Rome in 390 BCE had been a traumatic awakening, a reminder that the world beyond the Seven Hills was vast, unpredictable, and often hostile. As the Romans looked out from the charred remains of their forum, they did not see a reason to despair, but a mandate to rebuild with a permanence that could never again be shaken. They set to work constructing the Servian Wall, a massive circuit of tough stone that would serve as a silent guardian for centuries. This wall was not merely a physical barrier, it was a statement of intent. Rome was no longer a village that could be easily scattered. It was a fortress, a central point of gravity in a changing Italy. The 4th century BCE was a period of intense internal reflection and external expansion. While the city was being reconstructed in stone, the social order was being reconstructed in law. The Licinian Sextian laws finally opened the consulship to the plebeians, ensuring that the leadership of the state would reflect a broader base of the citizenry. This domestic stability was essential, for the challenges that lay ahead in the mountains of the Apennines would require a unity of purpose that the old, fractured Rome could never have sustained. To the east and south lay the territory of the Samnites, a confederation of rugged, warlike tribes who inhabited the high, cold valleys of the central mountains. The Samnites were the mirror image of the Romans, disciplined, brave, and deeply attached to their land. The struggle between these two powers, known as the Samnite Wars, would last for over half a century and would determine who would ultimately control the destiny of the Italian peninsula. The First Samnite War was a brief affair, sparked by a plea for help from the wealthy city of Capua, which had come under Samnite pressure. The Romans, recognizing the strategic value of the fertile plains of Campania, intervened. It was a war of skirmishes and mountain passes, ending in a stalemate that left both sides wary of the other. But the peace was merely a breathing space. The real test came during the Second Samnite War, a long and grueling conflict that saw the Romans suffer one of their most profound humiliations. In 321 BCE, a Roman army led by two consuls was lured into a narrow pass known as the Caudine Forks. Trapped between steep cliffs and blocked by fallen trees, the Romans found themselves unable to fight and unable to flee. Rather than slaughtering them, the Samnite general, Gaius Pontius, chose a different path of psychological warfare. He forced the Roman army to pass under a yoke, a symbolic gesture of subjugation made of 3 spears, before sending them home in shame. This defeat at the Caudine Forks could have broken a lesser people. For the Romans, however, it was a catalyst for radical change. They realized that their traditional hoplite phalanx, while effective on flat ground, was too rigid and cumbersome for the broken terrain of the mountains. They began to reorganize their legions into smaller, more flexible units called maniples. These handfuls of men could move independently, allowing the Roman line to bend without breaking and to adapt to the shifting contours of the battlefield. They also adopted the Samnite scutum, a large rectangular shield that offered better protection, and the pilum, a heavy javelin designed to bend upon impact, making it impossible for an enemy to throw back. While the legions were evolving, the state was literally paving the way for its future. In 312 BCE, the censor Appius Claudius Caecus began the construction of the Via Appia, the first of the great Roman roads. It stretched from Rome to Capua, a straight, unyielding line of stone that ignored the natural obstacles of the landscape. The Via Appia was a masterpiece of engineering, built with layers of gravel and heavy paving stones designed to carry the weight of entire legions and their supply trains in any weather. Along this road, the power of the Republic could flow without interruption. Appius Claudius also oversaw the construction of the first aqueduct, the Aqua Appia, bringing a steady supply of fresh water into the growing city. These projects marked the beginning of a Roman philosophy of infrastructure, that power was not just a matter of swords and shields, but of roads, water, and the ability to project influence over vast distances. The conclusion of the First Punic War in 241 BCE did not bring a lasting peace to the Mediterranean, but rather a cold and uneasy silence. The Treaty of Lutatius had stripped Carthage of its Sicilian holdings and burdened the merchant empire with a staggering indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver. For the Romans, the victory was a validation of their endurance, but for the Carthaginians, it was a wound that refused to heal. The silver was to be paid over 10 years, a constant, draining reminder of their defeat. As the Carthaginian ships sailed away from the shores of Sicily, the Western Mediterranean entered a period of transition, where the old boundaries were erased and the seeds of a much more terrible conflict were sown in the soil of bitterness and pride. While Rome began the process of organizing Sicily as its first overseas province, Carthage found itself plunged into an internal nightmare. The Mercenary War broke out when the Carthaginian government, bankrupt and broken, tried to negotiate the back pay of the thousands of foreign soldiers who had fought for them in Sicily. These veterans, many of whom had no home to return to, rose in a bloody rebellion that threatened to destroy Carthage from within. It was a war of unspeakable cruelty, characterized by massacres and a total lack of mercy. Rome, initially watching with a detached interest, eventually took advantage of Carthage's desperation. When the rebels on the island of Sardinia offered the island to Rome, the Senate hesitated, but eventually the temptation was too great. In an act that the historian Polybius called a shameful breach of faith, Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica, and when Carthage protested, Rome threatened a new war. Carthage, too weak to fight, was forced to cede the islands and pay an additional 1,200 talents. This Sardinian infamy ensured that the next war between these two powers would be one of survival, fueled by a Carthaginian hatred that was now absolute. In Rome, the years between the wars were occupied by the steady, rhythmic expansion into the north and east. The Adriatic Sea had become a sanctuary for Illyrian pirates, who, under the leadership of Queen Teuta, were plundering Italian merchant ships with impunity. The Romans sent ambassadors to complain, and when one of those ambassadors was murdered, the Republic acted with its characteristic directness. The First and Second Illyrian Wars were brief but significant. They cleared the Adriatic of piracy and established a Roman protectorate over several Greek cities along the coast. For the first time, Roman influence was firmly planted on the Balkan Peninsula, a move that brought the Republic into the complex diplomatic orbit of the Hellenistic kingdoms and the watchful eye of Macedonia. To the north, the Celtic tribes of the Po Valley, the Boii and the Insubres, watched the Roman expansion with growing alarm. In 225 BCE, a massive coalition of Gauls, including the fierce Gaisate from across the Alps, swept south toward Rome. It was a moment of panic, reminiscent of the Gallic sack of 390 BCE. The Romans, however, were no longer the disorganized people they had been 2 centuries prior. They mobilized a massive force, and at the Battle of Telamon, they trapped the Gallic army between 2 Roman forces. The slaughter was immense, and the victory allowed Rome to push into the Po Valley, founding the colonies of Placentia and Cremona. The northern frontier was moving toward the Alps, but the Romans did not realize that while they were securing their northern gate, the real threat was rising in the far west. Hamilcar Barca, the great Carthaginian general of the First Punic War, had turned his attention to Iberia. He saw the Spanish peninsula as a source of wealth and manpower that could replace everything Carthage had lost. He moved through the southern and eastern parts of Spain, building a new empire based on the rich silver mines and the fierce warrior tribes of the region. Hamilcar was a man who lived for revenge, and he raised his sons, Hannibal, Hasdrubal, and Mago, in a military camp, teaching them that Rome was the eternal enemy. It was during this time that the legendary oath took place. Before departing for Spain, Hamilcar led the 9-year-old Hannibal to an altar and made him swear that he would never be a friend to Rome. This oath was not a mere childhood promise. It was the foundational mission of Hannibal's life. With the death of Hamilcar in battle against the Oritani and the subsequent assassination of his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair, the young Hannibal was elevated by the soldiers to the position of supreme commander. He was 26 years old, yet he possessed the temperament of a veteran. To the Romans, who watched from across the sea, he was merely another Carthaginian general in a distant land. To his men, he was the reincarnation of his father's spirit, a leader who slept on the ground among his sentries, draped in a common soldier's cloak, and who was always the first to enter battle and the last to leave it. Hannibal knew that to fulfill his oath, he could not simply wait for Rome to come to him. He spent the first 2 years of his command consolidating the Barcid Empire in Iberia, bringing the fierce tribes of the interior under his sway through a mixture of diplomacy and decisive force. He was building more than an army. He was building a weapon designed specifically to dismantle the Roman Confederation. In the year 219 BCE, he turned his attention to Saguntum, a city that sat like a Roman sentinel on the Spanish coast. Although Saguntum lay south of the Ebro River, it had formed a pact of friendship with Rome, creating a diplomatic knot that Hannibal was eager to cut. The siege of Saguntum lasted 8 long months. It was a brutal, exhausting affair that tested the limits of Carthaginian engineering and Roman patience. The Saguntines defended their walls with a desperate ferocity, throwing fire-tipped spears and rebuilding shattered fortifications under the cover of night. Hannibal himself was wounded in the thigh by a javelin during an assault, an event that only deepened the resolve of his troops. As the city's food supplies vanished and the Roman Senate debated whether to send help, the people of Saguntum realized that no legions were coming to save them. In a final, tragic act of defiance, the city's leaders built a massive pyre in the public square, casting their gold, their silver, and finally themselves into the flames, rather than surrendering to the Barcid air. When news of the fall of Saguntum reached Rome, the hesitation of the Senate vanished, replaced by a cold, righteous anger. An embassy was dispatched to Carthage, led by Quintus Fabius Maximus. The scene in the Carthaginian Senate was one of profound tension. The Romans demanded the surrender of Hannibal and his staff as war criminals. The Carthaginians, emboldened by their successes in Spain and weary of Roman interference, refused to yield. It was then that Fabius gathered the folds of his toga to his chest, looking the Carthaginian elders in the eye. He told them that within the folds of his robe he carried both peace and war, and he asked them to choose. The reply from the Carthaginians was a defiant shout. "Give us whichever you wish." Fabius shook out the cloth, declaring that he gave them war. Hannibal was already prepared. Even as the Roman ambassadors were sailing home, he was wintering in New Carthage, organizing a force of legendary diversity. He sent his Spanish troops home for the winter to see their families, ensuring their loyalty for the long road ahead. He moved thousands of African soldiers to Spain and Spanish soldiers to Africa, a strategic exchange that ensured neither group could easily desert. By the spring of 218 BCE, he was ready to begin a march that would defy every convention of ancient warfare. He did not look toward the sea, where the Roman navy held absolute dominion. Instead, he looked toward the north, toward the Pyrenees, the Rhone, and the white, jagged peaks of the Alps. His departure from New Carthage was the beginning of a journey into the unknown. He led an army of nearly 90,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry, accompanied by 37 war elephants whose presence was intended to strike psychological terror into the heart of Italy. As they crossed the Ebro, they moved out of the world regulated by treaties and into a landscape of hostile tribes and uncharted wilderness. Hannibal's progress was slow and deliberate. He had to fight his way through the northern tribes, leaving a portion of his army behind to secure the passes and protect his lines of communication. By the time he reached the banks of the Rhone, his force had been trimmed by battle and desertion. Yet the core of his veteran Libyan and Spanish infantry remained unbreakable. The crossing of the Rhone was a masterpiece of logistics. The river was wide and swift, and a large force of Gauls waited on the opposite bank to oppose the landing. Hannibal ordered his men to construct a fleet of boats and rafts, while secretly sending a detachment upstream to cross in silence and circle behind the enemy. As the main body of the army began its crossing under a hail of arrows, the hidden detachment struck the Gallic camp from the rear with fire and steel. The ascent into the Alps began in the waning light of autumn, a season that brought a biting chill to the air and a sense of encroaching dread to the soldiers of the south. Hannibal's army, a sprawling column of men, horses, and baggage animals, began to wind its way into the narrow, claustrophobic valleys of the high mountains. The silence of the peaks was broken only by the rhythmic crunch of thousands of sandals on gravel and the low, guttering bellows of the elephants as they struggled with the steepening grade. This was a landscape that felt fundamentally alien to the Numidians and Libyans, who were used to the vast, open horizons of the sun-drenched plains. Here, the world was vertical, composed of jagged gray stone and dark forests of pine that seemed to press inward from every side. The physical environment was not the only enemy. As the army climbed higher, the local mountain tribes, the Allobroges, began to harass the column. They occupied the heights above the narrow passes, rolling massive boulders down onto the crowded troops below. In these confined spaces, a single rock could sweep dozens of men and pack animals into the abyss. Hannibal, ever the tactician, realized that the tribesmen only held these positions during the day, returning to their villages at night. Under the cover of darkness, he led a light-armed detachment to seize the high ground, allowing the rest of his army to pass through the most dangerous defiles with a measure of security. Yet the cost was high. The mountain paths were often so narrow that a single misstep meant a fall of hundreds of feet. The horses, terrified by the heights and the attacks, frequently panicked, causing more chaos and death than the weapons of the enemy. By the time the army reached the summit of the pass, the first snows of the year had begun to fall. The men were exhausted, frostbitten, and many were on the verge of mutiny. Sensing the collapse of their spirit, Hannibal gathered his troops on a high plateau that offered a rare view through the jagged peaks to the south. Pointing down toward the distant, hazy green of the Po Valley, he told them that they were looking at the gates of Italy. He promised them that the hardest part of their journey was behind them, and that the wealthy plains below were their reward. But the descent proved to be even more treacherous than the climb. The fresh snow hid treacherous patches of old ice from the previous winter. When the men stepped onto it, they slipped instantly, unable to find purchase on the steep slopes. Progress was halted entirely when the army encountered a massive rockfall that had obliterated the path. The drop was sheer, and there was no way around. Hannibal's response was a testament to his engineering ingenuity. He ordered his men to clear the snow and build a massive fire against the rock. When the stone was white hot, they poured their sour wine and vinegar into the fissures. The sudden change in temperature caused the rock to crack and shatter. His soldiers then worked in shifts with picks and crowbars, carving a new road into the cliffside. It took days of grueling labor, during which the animals were nearly starved, but eventually the path was wide enough for even the elephants to pass. When the remnants of the army finally stepped onto the level ground of the Insubrian territory, they were a shadow of the force that had left Spain. Of the nearly 40,000 infantry who had started the march, only 20,000 remained. The cavalry had been reduced to 6,000, and many of the elephants were weak and sickly. Despite their diminished numbers, the arrival of the Carthaginians in the Po Valley sent a shockwave through the Roman world. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the consul who had failed to intercept Hannibal at the Rhone, had rushed back to Italy by sea, taking command of the local legions in the north. He crossed the Po River and moved to meet Hannibal near the Ticinus River. This first encounter was not a full-scale battle, but a large cavalry skirmish that would set the tone for the conflict. The Roman cavalry, supported by light-armed skirmishers, found themselves outmatched by the speed and coordination of the Numidian horsemen. In the heat of the fight, Scipio was severely wounded and nearly captured. He was only saved by the extraordinary bravery of his 18-year-old son, who charged into the fray to rescue his father. The Romans retreated across the Ticinus, destroying the bridge behind them, but the psychological damage was done. The Gallic tribes of the region, seeing that the Romans could be defeated on their own soil, began to flock to Hannibal's banner, providing him with the fresh troops and supplies he desperately needed. As winter deepened, the second Roman consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, arrived from Sicily with his legions, joining Scipio near the Trebia River. Sempronius was an impulsive man, eager for a victory before his term of office expired and the new consuls were elected. Hannibal, reading his opponent's character with ease, prepared a trap. He sent a small force of cavalry to harass the Roman camp early on a freezing December morning. Sempronius, stung by the provocation, ordered his entire army to cross the Trebia in pursuit. The Roman soldiers had not yet eaten, and they were forced to wade chest-deep through the icy waters of the river. By the time they reached the opposite bank, they were numbed by the cold and exhausted. Hannibal's troops, by contrast, had been ordered to eat a warm meal and rub their bodies with oil by their fires. When the battle joined, the Romans fought with their usual stubbornness, but they were being outmaneuvered. At the height of the engagement, Hannibal's younger brother, Mago, emerged from a hidden ravine with 1,000 picked infantry and 1,000 cavalry, striking the Roman rear. The Roman lines crumbled. Thousands were cut down as they tried to flee back across the river, while others were pushed into the freezing water and drowned. Only a central corps of 10,000 Roman infantry managed to hack their way through the Carthaginian center and escape to the safety of Placentia. The victory at the Trebia made Hannibal the master of northern Italy. The Gauls now joined him in earnest, and the Roman Senate was forced to realize that this was not a border skirmish, but a threat to the existence of the Republic. For the campaign of 217 BCE, they elected two new consuls, Gnaeus Servilius Geminus and Gaius Flaminius. Flaminius was a popular leader, known for his defiance of the Senate, and he was determined to bring Hannibal to battle. Hannibal, meanwhile, moved south as soon as the winter snows began to melt. To bypass the Roman defensive positions on the main roads, he led his army through the flooded marshes of the Arno River. For 4 days and 3 nights, the soldiers marched through waist-deep water, unable to find dry land even to sleep. Many of the pack animals perished, and Hannibal himself, suffering from a severe ophthalmic infection, lost the sight in his right eye. Emerging from the marshes, Hannibal began to systematically lay waste to the rich lands of Etruria, burning farms and villas within sight of the Roman camp. He knew that Flaminius, a man of pride, would not be able to watch his allies' lands be destroyed without taking action. As Hannibal marched south toward Rome, he found the perfect location for an ambush on the northern shore of Lake Trasimene. The road ran narrowly between the steep, wooded hills and the water. On a morning thick with a heavy mist that clung to the lake, Flaminius led his legions into the narrow pass, believing he was hot on the heels of the Carthaginian rear guard. He failed to send out scouts into the hills. As the entire Roman column was stretched out along the shore, Hannibal gave the signal. The Carthaginian forces, hidden in the woods above, swept down in a coordinated assault. The Romans were caught in a trap from which there was no escape. The mist and the narrowness of the ground prevented them from forming any kind of defensive line. For 3 hours, the slaughter continued. Flaminius himself was killed by an Insubrian Gaul, and 15,000 Romans were either killed on the shore or driven into the lake to drown in their heavy armor. The news of the disaster at Trasimene reached Rome in a matter of days. The city was in a state of near paralysis. The gates were closed, and the Senate remained in session day and night. It was in this moment of existential crisis that the Romans turned to the ancient constitutional safeguard of the dictatorship. They appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus, a man of immense gravity and traditional Roman virtue. Fabius understood what his predecessors had not, that in a direct, pitched battle, Hannibal was invincible. His genius for tactics and his superior cavalry made any open confrontation a suicide mission for the legions. Fabius initiated a new strategy, one that would eventually bear his name. He refused to engage Hannibal in battle. Instead, he shadowed the Carthaginian army from the high ground, where Hannibal's cavalry was less effective. He implemented a scorched earth policy, ordering the rural population to take refuge in fortified cities and to destroy any crops or livestock they could not carry. He aimed to starve Hannibal out of Italy, depriving him of the supplies and the Gallic reinforcements he needed to sustain his campaign. To the Roman people, however, this looked like cowardice. They watched from their walls as Hannibal burned the heart of Italy, and they began to mock Fabius, calling him the delayer. The tension between the Fabian strategy and the Roman desire for action reached a breaking point in the elections for 216 BCE. The people chose Gaius Terentius Varro, a man of humble origins and fiery rhetoric, and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a more cautious aristocrat. Together, they were given command of the largest army Rome had ever put into the field, 8 legions, bolstered by an equal number of allies, totaling roughly 80,000 men. This massive force was intended to overwhelm Hannibal by sheer weight of numbers. The two armies met on the dusty plains of Apulia, near the town of Cannae. The ground was flat, favoring Hannibal's superior Numidian and Spanish cavalry. On the day of the battle, the command fell to Varro, who was determined to crush the Carthaginians in a single, massive charge. He packed his infantry into an exceptionally deep and narrow formation, intending to use the legions like a battering ram to smash through the Carthaginian center. Hannibal, seeing this, formed his own line into a crescent, with his veteran African infantry on the ends and his less reliable Gallic and Spanish troops in the center, bowing out toward the Romans. As the Roman mass surged forward, the Carthaginian center slowly gave way, retreating step by step, drawing the Romans deeper and deeper into the U-shape of the crescent. The Roman ranks became increasingly crowded as they pushed into the shrinking space. At the decisive moment, Hannibal's heavy cavalry, having routed the Roman horse on the flanks, swung around to the rear. Simultaneously, the veteran African infantry on the sides turned inward. The Romans were now completely surrounded, packed so tightly together that they could not even draw their swords. The battle turned into a systematic massacre that lasted until nightfall. By the end of the day, nearly 50,000 Romans lay dead in the dust of Cannae. Among them was the consul, Paulus, dozens of former magistrates, and nearly 80 senators. Varro managed to escape with a small group of cavalry, but the army of the Republic had ceased to exist. In the immediate aftermath of Cannae, the Italian Confederation began to fray. Major cities like Capua and Tarentum, believing that Rome was finished, defected to Hannibal. Yet, in the city of Rome itself, the Senate did not speak of surrender. They forbade the word peace to be uttered in the forum. They turned back to the strategies of Fabius, realizing that their only hope lay in a war of endurance. They began to rebuild, arming boys and even offering freedom to slaves who would fight in the legions. The Republic had been brought to the very edge of the abyss, but its foundations, laid in the centuries of the kings and the early wars of Italy, proved to be deeper than even Hannibal had imagined. As the campaign season of 216 BCE drew to a close, the war entered a new and more grinding phase. Hannibal had won the greatest tactical victory in history, but he found himself in a paradox. He could defeat Roman armies, but he could not defeat Rome. The city remained defiant, its walls high and its spirit unbroken. The war would now spread across the Mediterranean, from the hills of Sicily to the silver mines of Spain, as both powers prepared for a struggle that would last for another decade and a half. The shock of Cannae did not result in a Roman surrender, but in a strange, grim silence that settled over the city. The Senate refused to ransom the thousands of prisoners held by Hannibal, a cold message that there was no price for Roman life other than victory. The war now entered a phase of agonizing patience. In Italy, Hannibal moved his headquarters to Capua, a city of luxury that the Roman historians would later claim softened his hardened veterans. Yet, despite his presence, the Roman strategy of avoidance began to take its toll. The legions, led by figures like Marcus Claudius Marcellus, reclaimed lost ground through small, grinding sieges rather than open battles. The war was no longer about a single decisive blow, but about the slow erosion of Hannibal's resources and the steady, iron-willed reconstruction of the Roman military machine. In Sicily, the death of the pro-Roman king Hero led to the defection of Syracuse to the Carthaginian cause in 214 BCE. Rome could not allow this strategic island, the granary of the Mediterranean, to slip away. Marcellus was sent to reclaim it, leading to the famous 2-year siege of Syracuse. It was here that the genius of the scientist Archimedes was pitted against the iron will of the Roman legions. He designed massive cranes to lift Roman ships from the water, and mirrors to focus sunlight and set their sails ablaze. Despite these wonders, Syracuse fell in 212 BCE. Archimedes was killed in the chaos by a Roman soldier who did not recognize him, much to the regret of Marcellus. The wealth of the Greek city was stripped to adorn the streets of Rome, marking a major turning point in the Roman fascination with Hellenistic art and culture. The most significant shift, however, was occurring in the far west. In Spain, the elder Scipio brothers, Publius and Gnaeus, had been killed in 211 BCE, leaving the Roman presence there in tatters. The Senate, in a move born of both desperation and a recognition of singular talent, gave the command to the young Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son and nephew of the fallen. Only 24 years old and holding no high office, he arrived in Spain in 210 BCE with a charisma and tactical mind that rivaled Hannibal's own. He captured the Carthaginian capital of New Carthage in a daring amphibious assault, using the low tide to scale the walls. He won the loyalty of the Spanish tribes not just through force, but through a calculated display of Roman clemency and justice, systematically dismantling the Barcid power base that had sustained Hannibal's campaign for a decade. The year 207 BCE brought a final, terrifying threat to the Italian heartland. Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal, had managed to cross the Alps with a fresh army, hoping to join his brother for a final combined march on the city of Rome itself. The Republic was exhausted, its treasury empty and its manpower drained. Yet it found the strength for one last gamble. The consul, Gaius Claudius Nero, intercepted Hasdrubal's messengers and, in a secret, forced night march, joined his colleague in the north. At the Battle of the Metaurus, the Romans trapped Hasdrubal's forces against the river. Hasdrubal was defeated and killed in the thick of the fight. To inform Hannibal of his brother's arrival, the Romans threw Hasdrubal's severed head into the Carthaginian camp. Hannibal, seeing the features of his brother, realized that the dream of a Punic victory in Italy had finally withered. Scipio, returning from Spain as a hero, proposed a final, daring strike. In 204 BCE, he invaded Africa, forcing the Carthaginian Senate to recall Hannibal from Italy. After 15 years of undefeated campaigning on the peninsula, the great general finally sailed for home. The two giants of the ancient world finally met on the field of Zama in 202 BCE. They reportedly held a private conference before the battle, two masters of war looking upon one another in a moment of quiet respect. But the battle was inevitable. Scipio had secured the alliance of the Numidian king Massinissa, depriving Hannibal of his legendary cavalry advantage. Through a clever reorganization of his ranks, Scipio neutralized Hannibal's elephants. The battle was long and bloody, but eventually, the Carthaginian lines broke. Hannibal survived and fled, but the Empire of Carthage was finished. The peace treaty of 201 BCE was crushing. Carthage was stripped of its fleet, its Spanish territories, and its right to wage war without Roman consent. Rome was now the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. The long struggle had changed the city forever, transforming a regional power into a global hegemon. Yet, the internal costs of this victory, the ruined farms of Italy, the displaced peasants, and the rising wealth of the elite, were seeds of a different kind of conflict. The victory over Hannibal had left Rome as the undisputed hegemon of the West. But the horizon of the Republic was no longer limited by the Mediterranean coast of Spain or the ruins of Carthage. The gaze of the Senate now turned toward the east, to the ancient and fractured kingdoms of the Hellenistic world. This was a land of philosophers, massive phalanxes, and the lingering legacy of Alexander the Great. The Romans did not necessarily seek to conquer the East at first. They were drawn in by the complex web of Greek diplomacy and the pleas of smaller states like Pergamon and Rhodes, who lived in the shadow of the Macedonian king Philip V. The Second Macedonian War, beginning in 200 BCE, was not a war of survival like the Punic conflict, but a war of prestige and balance. The Roman legions, now the most experienced fighting force in the world, met the Macedonian phalanx at the Battle of Cynocephalae in 197 BCE. The phalanx, with its long sarissa spears, was a formidable wall of iron when moving forward on level ground. However, on the broken hills of Thessaly, the Roman maniple proved its superior flexibility. The legions flowed into the gaps of the rigid Macedonian lines, breaking the power of the successors. At the Isthmian Games following the war, the Roman general Titus Quinctius Flamininus made a dramatic proclamation that echoed through the Greek world. The Greeks were to be free from Macedonian rule. The Greeks wept with joy, unaware that their freedom was now a gift held at the pleasure of the Roman Senate.
This eastern entanglement soon brought Rome into conflict with the Seleucid Empire and its king, Antiochus III, who had welcomed the exiled Hannibal into his court. The Syrian War was a brief but decisive demonstration of Roman reach. At the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BCE, the Romans, led by Scipio Asiaticus, the brother of Africanus, shattered the multi-ethnic army of the Seleucids. The Treaty of Apamea followed, effectively ending Seleucid influence in the Mediterranean and making Rome the ultimate arbiter of the East. But while Rome was winning empires abroad, the soul of the city was undergoing a profound and troubling transformation. The wealth from the East, vast quantities of silver, art, and enslaved people, began to flood into Italy. This sudden influx of capital created a widening gulf between the wealthy patricians and the common plebeians. The small farmers who had formed the backbone of the legions returned from decades of war to find their lands neglected and their livelihoods undercut by the latifundia, massive estates owned by the elite and worked by thousands of enslaved captives. The traditional Roman virtue of frugalitas was being eroded by the luxuries of the Orient, a shift that deeply concerned traditionalists like Cato the Elder. Cato's anxiety was not just cultural, it was focused on a lingering ghost from the past. He ended every speech in the Senate, no matter the topic, with the famous phrase, "Carthago delenda est." Carthage must be destroyed. Though Carthage was a shadow of its former self, its economic recovery sparked Roman fear. In 149 BCE, the Third Punic War began on a legal pretext. It was not a war of great maneuvers, but a 3-year siege of attrition. In 146 BCE, Scipio Aemilianus, the grandson by adoption of Africanus, broke through the walls. The city was systematically leveled, its citizens sold into slavery, and the site cursed. Carthage was erased from the map. That same year, the city of Corinth was also destroyed as a warning to the rebellious Greeks. Rome had become a predator. The Republic was now a world power, but the strain of managing such vast territories without a professional bureaucracy was beginning to show. The internal stability that had survived Hannibal could not survive the greed of its own aristocracy. In 133 BCE, a young aristocrat named Tiberius Gracchus was elected tribune of the plebs. He saw the empty countryside and the crowded, impoverished streets of Rome and proposed a land reform law to redistribute public land to the landless poor. Tiberius was met with unprecedented opposition from the Senate, who saw his reforms as a threat to their wealth and power. Breaking centuries of tradition, Tiberius bypassed the Senate and took his law directly to the People's Assembly. The political atmosphere turned poisonous. When Tiberius sought re-election to the tribunate, a move of questionable legality, a mob of senators and their clients, armed with wooden clubs and fragments of benches, attacked him in the forum. Tiberius and 300 of his followers were killed, their bodies thrown into the Tiber. This was the first time that political disagreement in Rome had been settled with the blood of citizens. The influence of Greek culture, the captive Greece that captured her captor, brought new schools of philosophy like Stoicism to Rome, forever altering the intellectual landscape of the ruling class. This tension between the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors, and the allure of Hellenism created a cultural friction that would define the Roman identity for the next century. The long, slow decline of the Republic into civil war and the age of the charismatic generals had begun. The retirement and death of Sulla had left a void that the Senate, despite its restored powers, was ill-equipped to fill. The old machinery of the Republic was grinding against the reality of a world that now required professional armies and permanent commands. The first major test of this new era came not from a foreign king, but from the very bottom of Roman society. In 73 BCE, a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus escaped from a training school in Capua with 70 others. What began as a local breakout quickly swelled into the Third Servile War, a massive slave rebellion that gathered over 70,000 displaced and desperate people. For 2 years, Spartacus outmaneuvered Roman legions, defeating them in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius and marching nearly the length of the peninsula. To the Roman elite, this was a nightmare come to life. The tools of their luxury had turned into an army of vengeance. The task of ending the rebellion fell to Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, who had made his fortune buying the properties of those Sulla had proscribed. Crassus trapped the slave army in the south, but as he was closing the net, Pompey the Great arrived from Spain, fresh from defeating the rebel Sertorius. Pompey intercepted the stragglers and claimed the glory for himself, sparking a lifelong rivalry between the two men. The 60s BCE belonged to Pompey. He was granted unprecedented, extraordinary commands. In just 40 days, he cleared the entire Mediterranean of the pirates who had been choking Rome's grain supply. He then marched east, finally ending the threat of Mithridates, annexing Syria, and even entering the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Jerusalem. When he returned to Italy in 62 BCE, the Senate feared he would be a second Sulla. Instead, Pompey disbanded his legions, asking only for land for his veterans and the ratification of his eastern settlements. The Senate, led by arch-conservatives like Cato the Younger, foolishly blocked him. They also blocked Crassus, who wanted tax breaks for his business allies. It was this legislative gridlock that allowed a charismatic, debt-ridden aristocrat named Gaius Julius Caesar to step into the gap. Caesar was a master of the populares style, charming the masses and outmaneuvering his peers. In 60 BCE, he convinced Pompey and Crassus to set aside their hatred and form an informal alliance, the First Triumvirate. This three-headed monster effectively bypassed the Senate, using Pompey's military prestige, Crassus's money, and Caesar's political skill to run the state for their own benefit. As part of the deal, Caesar was granted the governorship of Illyricum and Gaul. He needed a war, not just for the glory, but to pay off his staggering debts and to build an army that was as loyal to him as Pompey's was to him. For 8 years, 58 to 50 BCE, Caesar campaigned across what is now France, Belgium, and even crossed into Britain. The Gallic Wars were a masterpiece of both military brilliance and self-promotion. Caesar sent regular dispatches back to Rome, his commentaries written in lean, punchy prose that made every victory seem like a triumph for the Roman people. The climax of the Gallic campaign came at the siege of Alesia in 52 BCE. Caesar faced a unified Gallic resistance under the chieftain Vercingetorix. To capture the hilltop fort, Caesar built a massive line of fortifications facing inward to starve the Gauls, and a second line facing outward to protect his men from a Gallic relief army. It was a feat of engineering that defied belief. When Vercingetorix finally surrendered, the conquest of Gaul was complete. Rome had added a massive new territory, hundreds of thousands of slaves, and Caesar had forged the most battle-hardened army in human history. But the Concordia of the Triumvirate was dying. In 54 BCE, Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's beloved wife, died in childbirth, severing the personal tie between the two giants. The following year, Crassus, seeking his own military glory, led an army against the Parthian Empire in the east. He was disastrously defeated and killed at the Battle of Carrhae, his head reportedly used as a prop in a Greek play at the Parthian court. With Crassus gone, the balance was shattered. The Senate, now more afraid of Caesar's popularity and his legions than they were of Pompey, reached out to Pompey, making him their champion. They demanded that Caesar resign his command and return to Rome as a private citizen to face trial for his earlier political irregularities. Caesar knew that to return without his army was to face exile or death. On the night of January 10th, 49 BCE, Caesar stood on the banks of the Rubicon, the small river that marked the boundary between his province and Italy. To cross it with an army was an act of treason, a declaration of civil war. Legend says he hesitated, looking at the dark water, before uttering the words, "Alea iacta est." The die is cast. He crossed the river, and the Republic, already hollowed by decades of violence, finally collapsed into the greatest civil war the Roman world had ever seen. When Caesar's boots splashed into the cold waters of the Rubicon, the sound echoed far beyond the riverbanks. It was the sound of 1,000 years of tradition snapping. By crossing that boundary with his legions, Caesar had not just declared war on Pompey, he had declared war on the very idea that the law was greater than the man. The panic in Rome was absolute. The Senate, which had spent years posturing and passing decrees against Caesar, suddenly realized that decrees were useless against veteran soldiers. Pompey, the man who had once claimed he could raise an army just by stamping his foot on the soil of Italy, found that his feet were standing on hollow ground. He realized he could not hold the city. In a move that shocked the Roman world, Pompey, the consuls, and most of the Senate fled south to the port of Brundisium and sailed across the Adriatic to Greece. Rome, the heart of the world, was left empty, waiting for its new master to walk through the gates. Caesar did not rush to follow Pompey. He was a master of the inner lines. He knew that Pompey's strength lay in his veteran legions in Spain. If he followed Pompey to Greece, he would be trapped between two fires. With a characteristic burst of speed, Caesar marched his men to Spain, famously remarking, "I go to meet an army without a leader, and I shall return to meet a leader without an army." After a grueling campaign of maneuvers at Ilerda, Caesar forced the Pompeian legions to surrender without a massive slaughter. He showed them clementia, mercy, allowing them to go home or join his ranks. With the West secured, Caesar turned his gaze toward the east. In 48 BCE, he landed in Greece with a smaller, hungrier force than Pompey's. The two giants finally collided at the Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey had the numbers, the supplies, and the backing of the aristocracy. But Caesar had the men who had spent 8 years in the mud of Gaul. At the height of the battle, Caesar used a hidden fourth line of infantry to strike at Pompey's cavalry. The invincible Pompey saw his lines crumble, and for the first time in his legendary career, he fled the field in despair. Pompey sought refuge in Egypt, hoping the young King Ptolemy XIII would remember his past favors. Instead, as Pompey stepped off his boat onto the Egyptian sand, he was stabbed to death by his own former soldiers, now in the service of the king. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria days later and was presented with Pompey's severed head, he did not rejoice. He wept. He was a Roman, and this was not the end a great man deserved. Caesar's stay in Egypt became a legend of its own. He became entangled in a dynastic civil war between Ptolemy and his sister queen, Cleopatra VII. In the Alexandrine War, Caesar was nearly killed twice, once having to swim for his life in the harbor while holding his journals above his head. But he emerged victorious, placing Cleopatra on the throne and eventually fathering a son with her. When he finally returned to Rome, Caesar was no longer just a general. He was the state. He was named Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. He began a whirlwind of reforms that aimed to fix the rot that had killed the Gracchi. He settled his veterans on land outside Italy. He expanded the Senate to include Gauls and Spaniards. And most famously, he reformed the calendar. With the help of Egyptian astronomers, he created the Julian calendar, finally aligning the Roman year with the sun, a system we still largely use today. But Caesar's mercy was also his undoing. He allowed his former enemies back into the Senate, believing that his clementia would win their hearts. He was wrong. To men like Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, Caesar was not a reformer. He was a tyrant who would put a crown on the head of the Republic. They saw the statues of Caesar being dressed in royal robes and his face appearing on coins, things no Roman had ever done while living. The conspiracy grew in the shadows of the Senate. On the Ides of March 15th, 44 BCE, Caesar walked into the theater of Pompey for a Senate meeting. He had been warned by seers and his wife's dreams, but he went anyway, unaccompanied by his bodyguards. As he took his seat, the conspirators gathered around him under the pretext of presenting a petition. Then, the first blade struck. Caesar fought back until he saw Brutus, a man he had treated like a son, among the attackers. Legend says he pulled his toga over his head and accepted the end. He fell at the base of a statue of his old rival, Pompey. The assassins ran into the streets crying, "Liberty!" but they found only silence. The people of Rome were not joyful. They were terrified. At Caesar's funeral, the consul Mark Antony gave a speech that turned the tide of public opinion, revealing that Caesar had left a gift of money to every Roman citizen in his will. The city erupted in grief and rage. The conspirators fled, and a new vacuum of power opened, one that would be filled not by the old Senate, but by a 19-year-old boy named Octavian, whom Caesar had secretly adopted in his will. The Republic was dead, though it would take another 13 years of blood and fire to realize it. The smoke from Caesar's funeral pyre had barely cleared before the realization set in. The assassins had a plan to kill a man, but no plan to run a world. Brutus and Cassius had expected the Republic to simply wake up once the tyrant was gone. But the Republic was not asleep. It was dying of old age and internal rot. Into this chaos stepped a ghost. A 19-year-old boy named Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew, arrived in Italy from his studies in Illyria. To everyone's shock, Caesar's will had named this sickly, unknown teenager as his primary heir and adopted son. Mark Antony, Caesar's former right-hand man, laughed at the boy, refusing to hand over Caesar's private funds. But Octavian, as he was now called, possessed a cold, calculating brilliance that far surpassed his years. He began to sell his own property to pay the legacies Caesar had promised the people, effectively buying the loyalty of the Roman mob and Caesar's veteran legions. By 43 BCE, the political winds shifted. Octavian, Antony, and a third general named Lepidus realized they could not destroy each other while the assassins, Brutus and Cassius, were gathering a massive army in the east. They met on a small island in a river near Bononia and formed the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the first one, this was a formal, legal commission for the reconstitution of the Republic. Their first act was one of cold-blooded pragmatism. To fund their war and eliminate internal threats, they revived Sulla's proscriptions. They wrote names on a list, and those men were marked for death. The most famous victim was Cicero, the great orator and defender of the Republic, who had given a series of scathing speeches against Antony. Cicero was caught and executed. His head and hands were nailed to the rostra in the forum where he had once spoken so eloquently. The message was clear. The age of debate was over. The age of the sword had returned. In 42 BCE, the triumvirs crossed into Greece to face the liberators. At the Battle of Philippi, the last remnants of the old Republican cause were crushed. Brutus and Cassius, seeing their lines break, committed suicide. With the assassins gone, the world was theirs to divide. Antony took the wealthy, sophisticated East. Octavian took the volatile, rugged West, including Rome itself, and Lepidus was given Africa. While Octavian struggled with land riots and a naval war against Pompey's son in the West, Antony fell under the spell of Egypt. In Tarsus, he met Cleopatra VII. She arrived on a gilded barge with purple sails, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, and Antony, a man of appetites and grand gestures, was instantly captivated. Their alliance was both romantic and political. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund a campaign against Parthia, and Cleopatra needed Roman protection for her children. In Rome, Octavian used this to his advantage. He launched a brilliant propaganda campaign, painting Antony not as a Roman general, but as a renegade who had been bewitched by an Oriental queen. He claimed Antony wanted to move the capital of the world to Alexandria. When Antony officially divorced Octavian's sister and named Cleopatra's children as his heirs, Octavian had his casus belli. This would not be a civil war between two Romans. It would be a holy war for the soul of Italy against an evil foreign queen. The final collision took place in 31 BCE at the Battle of Actium, a naval engagement off the coast of Greece. Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, used smaller, more maneuverable ships to outflank Antony's massive, towering galleys. In the heat of the battle, Cleopatra's squadron suddenly turned and fled back toward Egypt, and Antony, in a moment of tragic desperation, abandoned his men to follow her. His army surrendered without a fight. A year later, as Octavian's forces closed in on Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra both took their own lives, ending the 3,000-year-old line of the pharaohs. Egypt was annexed as Octavian's private province. Octavian returned to Rome in 29 BCE as the sole master of the Mediterranean. He was 33 years old. He had seen what happened to Caesar, so he did not claim the title of king or dictator. Instead, in 27 BCE, in a carefully choreographed piece of political theater, he restored the Republic to the Senate. In return, a grateful Senate gave him the name Augustus, the revered one, and the title of princeps, or first citizen. This was the birth of the Roman Empire. On the surface, the old offices remained. There were still consuls, praetors, and senators, but behind the curtain, Augustus held all the strings. He controlled the treasury, the grain supply, and, most importantly, the legions. He initiated the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and stability that would last for 2 centuries. He rebuilt the city in marble, created a professional police force and fire brigade, and established a civil service that could actually govern the vast territories. As Augustus lay on his deathbed in 14 CE, he reportedly asked his friends if he had played his part well in the comedy of life. He had. He had taken a world of fire and blood and turned it into a world of stone and law. The Republic was a memory, and the long, golden, and sometimes terrifying age of the emperors had begun. The death of Augustus in 14 CE marked the first time the Roman world had to face a peaceful transfer of absolute power. The first citizen was gone, and in his place stood his stepson, Tiberius. The transition was quiet, but it revealed a fundamental truth. The Republic was truly gone. The Senate did not debate who should lead. They waited for the new master to accept the burden. Tiberius was a grim, middle-aged soldier who never truly wanted to be emperor. He lacked Augustus's charm and preferred the company of his books to the theater of politics. Under his reign, the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite bodyguards, began to realize their own power. Their commander, Sejanus, effectively ran the city while Tiberius retreated to the island of Capri to live in paranoid isolation. It was a dark time, filled with treason trials and a growing sense of fear in the Roman elite. When Tiberius died, the people cheered for the young Gaius, nicknamed Caligula, Little Boots. He was the son of the beloved general Germanicus and represented a fresh start. But after a serious illness, something in Caligula snapped. The Golden Boy became a nightmare. He demanded to be worshipped as a living god, threatened to make his horse a consul, and emptied the treasury on bizarre projects. In 41 CE, the Praetorian Guard, the very men sworn to protect him, cornered him in a palace corridor and stabbed him to death. The Senate briefly debated restoring the Republic, but the soldiers had already found their next candidate. Hidden behind a curtain in the palace, the guards found Claudius, the uncle of Caligula. Long dismissed as a fool because of a physical limp and a stammer, Claudius was actually a brilliant historian. He proved to be one of Rome's most effective administrators. Conquest of Britain. In 43 CE, Claudius did what even Julius Caesar could not. He successfully launched the invasion and annexation of Britain. Infrastructure. He built new aqueducts and the great port of Ostia to secure Rome's food supply. However, his domestic life was his downfall. His fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, was determined to see her son on the throne. Legend says she poisoned Claudius with a dish of mushrooms to clear the path for the last of the line. Nero began his reign at 17, guided by his tutor, the philosopher Seneca. But as he grew older, his artistic obsessions and paranoia took over. In 64 CE, a great fire ravaged Rome. While Nero did not fiddle while Rome burned, the fiddle didn't exist yet. He did use the cleared land to build a massive, gold-plated palace called the Domus Aurea. To deflect blame, he targeted a small, new religious sect called the Christians, beginning the first Roman persecution. By 68 CE, the provinces had had enough. Governors in Gaul and Spain rose in revolt. Abandoned by the Senate and the Praetorian Guard, Nero fled the city and committed suicide, allegedly crying out, "Qualis artifex perio?" What an artist dies in me. With the death of Nero, the Julio-Claudian bloodline was extinct. For the first time, Rome learned a secret of empire, that an emperor could be made elsewhere than at Rome. In a single year, 4 generals, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian, scrambled for the throne. It was a brief, bloody return to the chaos of the civil wars. The survivor was Vespasian, a plain-spoken soldier of the middle class. He founded the Flavian dynasty
and brought a sense of stability back to a city scarred by Nero's excesses. To win back the people, he tore down Nero's private lake and began building the Flavian Amphitheater, known today as the Colosseum. It was a gift of bread and circuses to the masses, a symbol that the empire was under new management. The Roman world was no longer the plaything of a single family. It was becoming a vast, professional bureaucracy, governed by the strength of the legions and the pragmatic needs of a global state. The frontier was stabilizing, the cities were growing, and the age of the good emperors was appearing on the horizon.
Vespasian was a man of the earth, a general who smelled of the camp rather than the palace. He knew that after the madness of Nero and the chaos of the civil wars, Rome did not need a god. It needed a builder. He inherited a treasury that was not just empty, but echoing, and a people whose faith in the Principate had been shattered. To fix this, he began the most iconic construction project in human history. He took the side of Nero's private lake, a symbol of one man's ego, and began to drain it to build the Flavian Amphitheater. This was the Colosseum, a gift to the Roman people that said the city belonged to them again. While the stone was being laid in Rome, his son Titus was in the east, finishing a brutal war that had begun under Nero. In 70 CE, the Roman legions broke through the walls of Jerusalem. The Second Temple was destroyed, and the treasures of Judea were carried back to Rome to fund the new dynasty. Vespasian reigned for 10 years, restoring the borders and the budget, famously joking on his deathbed as he tried to stand up, "Vai, puto Deus fio." Dear me, I think I'm becoming a god. His son Titus took the throne in 79 CE, but his short reign was marked by a series of calamities that felt almost biblical. Just months into his rule, the mountain known as Vesuvius, which the locals thought was just a green hill, exploded with a fury that buried the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum in hours. Titus rushed to the scene, spending his own money to help the survivors, only to return to Rome to find the city once again ravaged by a great fire and then a plague. He died after only 2 years, beloved by the people, but exhausted by the weight of the world. Then came his younger brother, Domitian. If Titus was the light of the world, Domitian was the shadow. He was a micromanager who mistrusted the Senate and preferred to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. He built a massive palace on the Palatine Hill that still looms over the Forum today, but he lived in it like a prisoner of his own making, lining the walls with polished stone so he could see the reflection of anyone sneaking up behind him. In 96 CE, his fears were realized when his own household staff stabbed him to death in his bedchamber. The Senate, in a final act of defiance, condemned his memory and chose one of their own to lead, the elderly and childless Nerva. This was the beginning of the most stable and prosperous era in the history of the world, often called the Age of the Five Good Emperors. Nerva knew he was a stopgap, so he did something radical. He ignored bloodlines and adopted the best man for the job. He chose Trajan, a brilliant general from Spain, the first emperor born outside of Italy. Trajan was the Roman ideal brought to life. He was a soldier emperor who treated the senators as his equals and the soldiers as his brothers. Under his command, Rome went on its last great journey of conquest. He crossed the Danube into Dacia, modern-day Romania, defeating King Decebalus and bringing back so much gold that he abolished taxes for a year and funded a massive new forum and a victory column that still stands today. But Trajan did not stop there. He marched east, following the ghost of Alexander the Great. He annexed Armenia, Mesopotamia, and reached the shores of the Persian Gulf.
In 117 CE, the Roman Empire reached its absolute territorial peak. A single law and a single coin ruled from the rainy hills of Scotland to the scorching sands of Iraq. But as Trajan lay dying on his way back to Rome, the empire had become so large that it was starting to crack under its own immense weight. The age of expansion was over. The age of the wall was about to begin.
Hadrian was a man who looked at the map of the world and saw a project that was finally complete. He didn't want more land. He wanted a finished masterpiece. To the shock of the old generals who had ridden with Trajan, Hadrian's first act was to walk away from the newly conquered territories in the east. He understood a truth that few leaders ever accept, that an empire can die from eating too much. He spent his reign as a restless traveler, walking thousands of miles with his legions, eating their salt pork and sleeping in their tents. He wasn't just inspecting the troops, he was defining the edge of the Roman mind. In the damp gray hills of northern Britain, he ordered the construction of a wall that would stretch from sea to sea. It was a 73-mile scar of stone and turf, but it was more than a fortification. It was a statement to the barbarians that the Roman sun had reached its zenith and would go no further. In Rome, he built the Pantheon, a temple with a dome so perfect it seemed to hold the sky itself, a testament to his obsession with Greek harmony. But beneath the surface of this golden age, the first cracks were appearing. The Roman economy was becoming stagnant, and the army was turning from a force of conquest into a stationary police force, rooted to the soil of the provinces they guarded. Then came Antoninus Pius, a man so steady and quiet that history almost forgot him. For 23 years, he governed from Italy, never seeing a battle, never facing a major revolt. It was the golden noon of the empire, a period of such profound stillness that it felt as if the Pax Romana might last forever. But the stillness was an illusion. While Antoninus governed with a gentle hand, the great migrations of the north were beginning to stir, and a shadow was growing in the east. When Marcus Aurelius took the throne, the long summer ended. Marcus was a man who wanted only to be a philosopher, to sit in the quiet of his library and contemplate the nature of the soul. Instead, fate cast him into a world of fire and blood. He spent his years in a tent on the freezing banks of the Danube, fighting a desperate, grinding war against the Germanic tribes that were now pouring over the borders in waves. In his tent at night, by the light of a flickering lamp, he wrote his Meditations, reminding himself that life is a short watch, and that a man's only duty is to remain just and kind, even when the world is falling apart. And the world was falling apart. In 165 CE, a plague arrived from the east, a silent killer that we now believe was smallpox. It swept through the cities and the camps, killing millions, including Marcus's co-emperor. The tax base collapsed, the legions were hollowed out, and for the first time, the Romans began to feel a deep, existential dread. Marcus died in the cold of the frontier, and with him died the era of the good emperors. He broke the tradition of adoption and left the world to his biological son, Commodus. Commodus was a nightmare in purple. He had none of his father's wisdom and all of a tyrant's vanity. He obsessed over the gladiatorial games, eventually entering the arena himself to slaughter animals and men, while the administration of the empire rotted away. When he was finally strangled in his bath in 192 CE, the Roman world plunged into a century of chaos that nearly ended it. The year 193 CE became the year of the 5 emperors. The Praetorian Guard reached the ultimate peak of arrogance. They literally put the Roman Empire up for auction, selling the throne to the highest bidder, a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus. The legions in the provinces were disgusted. They marched on Rome, and the winner was Septimius Severus, a hard-bitten general from North Africa. Severus understood the new reality. On his deathbed, his final advice to his sons was, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others." The empire was no longer a partnership between the Senate and the princeps. It was a military dictatorship. The crisis of the 3rd century had begun. For 50 years, the throne would be a death sentence. Generals would be proclaimed emperor by their troops, only to be murdered months later by the same men. The empire shattered. A breakaway Gallic empire formed in the west, and a Palmyrene empire rose in the east under the warrior queen Zenobia. The Roman world was being pulled apart by civil war, hyperinflation, and constant barbarian invasions. It seemed that the legacy of Augustus was finally crumbling into the dust. The city of Rome, which had not seen an enemy at its gates for centuries, began to build massive new walls, huddled in fear of a world it could no longer control. The empire was on the verge of total collapse when a man named Aurelian rode out to save it. He was a soldier through and through, earning the title Restorer of the World by defeating the breakaway empires in Gaul and Palmyra in a whirlwind of just 5 years. But Aurelian was assassinated by his own men, a victim of the very chaos he tried to cure. It was not until 284 CE that a visionary named Diocletian took the throne and realized that the Roman Empire was no longer a state. It was an emergency. Diocletian was the great surgeon of the Roman world. He decided that the empire was too large for any one man to govern or defend effectively. He split the world in two, east and west, and then split it again, creating the Tetrarchy, or the Rule of Four. There would be 2 senior emperors, the Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, the Caesars. He moved the capitals away from Rome to cities closer to the frontiers, like Milan and Nicomedia, effectively demoting the Eternal City to a historic monument. He fixed prices, expanded the bureaucracy, and launched the final, most brutal persecution of the rising Christian sect, whom he saw as a threat to the traditional Roman order. But the system Diocletian built relied on his own iron will. When he did something no emperor had ever done, voluntarily abdicated to go grow cabbages at his palace in Salona, the Tetrarchy collapsed almost immediately into a civil war between the ambitious sons of the rulers. Out of this fire emerged Constantine, a man who would change the course of human history. In 312 CE, on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, legend says Constantine saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light with the words, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol on their shields. He won the battle, took Rome, and issued the Edict of Milan, which finally legalized Christianity and ended centuries of underground worship. Constantine was a bridge between 2 worlds, the old Roman power and a new rising faith. He didn't just legalize the church, he patronized it, calling the Council of Nicaea to settle religious disputes and ensure the faith was unified.
Perhaps his most lasting legacy was the founding of a new Rome. He saw that the wealth, the culture, and the threats were now in the east. On the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, he built Constantinople. It was a fortress city, perfectly positioned between Europe and Asia, guarded by water on three sides. This was the birth of what would become the Byzantine Empire. For the next 1,000 years, even as Rome itself fell, the Roman light would continue to burn in these golden halls. But the shift to the east left the west increasingly vulnerable. The frontiers were quiet for a time, but the pressure was building. Beyond the Rhine and the Danube, a new and terrible force was moving: the Huns, a shadow from the deep steppes of Asia that would push the Germanic tribes into a final, desperate collision with the Roman world. The end of the 4th century saw the last moment of true unity under Theodosius I, who made Christianity the official state religion of Rome. When he died in 395 CE, he divided the empire between his two young sons. This time, the split was permanent. The West was left to face the storm alone. In 410 CE, for the first time in 800 years, an enemy entered the gates of Rome. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, sacked the city. It wasn't the end of the empire, but it was the end of its invincibility. The psychological blow was total. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, wept, "The city which has taken the whole world is itself taken." The final decades were a slow, agonizing slide. The Western Empire became a series of small, fortified pockets surrounded by Germanic kingdoms. The end came not with a massive battle, but with a whimper. In 476 CE, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus. He didn't even bother to take the title of emperor. He sent the imperial robes back to Constantinople, declaring that the West no longer needed a ruler of its own. The Roman Empire in the West was gone, but the Roman idea remained. It lived on in the Latin language, in the Catholic Church, in the law codes of Europe, and in the golden survival of Constantinople in the East. The story of Rome had ended, but the Middle Ages had just begun.
While the West descended into a mosaic of Germanic kingdoms, the torch of Rome did not flicker out. It simply moved its center of gravity. In Constantinople, the Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, began a transformation that would allow it to survive for another 1,000 years. The man who most embodied this survival was Justinian I, who took the throne in 527 CE. He was a man of restless energy who slept little and dreamed big. He did not see himself as a new ruler, but as a restorer of the ancient glory. His greatest achievement was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Code of Justinian. He realized that 1,000 years of Roman law had become a tangled thicket of contradictions. He ordered his scholars to prune and organize it into a single logical system. This code became the foundation of justice for almost every modern legal system in the Western world. But Justinian wanted more than just laws. He wanted the land back. He sent his brilliant general, Belisarius, to reclaim the lost provinces of the West. In a series of lightning campaigns, the Romans retook North Africa from the Vandals and, after a long and agonizing war, reclaimed the Italian peninsula and the city of Rome itself. To celebrate this reconquest, Justinian built the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. It was a building that defied the physics of the age, with a massive golden dome that seemed, in the words of a contemporary, to be suspended by a golden chain from heaven. For nearly a millennium, it remained the largest cathedral in the world. But the reconquest was a Pyrrhic victory. The wars had drained the treasury and devastated the Italian countryside, and a new outbreak of the bubonic plague, the plague of Justinian, killed nearly a quarter of the empire's population. As the 7th century dawned, the Roman East faced a challenge it could not outmaneuver. From the deserts of Arabia, a new force emerged under the banner of Islam. In a matter of decades, the Roman provinces of Syria, Egypt, and North Africa, territories that had been Roman for 700 years, were lost forever. The empire was forced to adapt or die. It abandoned the old Latin language for Greek and reorganized its remaining lands into themes, or military districts. Constantinople became a fortress state, the shield of Christendom against the waves of invasion from the east. The city survived 2 massive Arab sieges, thanks in part to a secret weapon known as Greek fire, a napalm-like liquid that burned even on water and incinerated the enemy fleets. Through the Middle Ages, the empire saw periods of resurgence, particularly under the Macedonian dynasty, which pushed the borders back into the Balkans and the East. But the final wound came from an unexpected direction. In 1204 CE, the soldiers of the Fourth Crusade, who had set out to reclaim Jerusalem, were diverted to Constantinople. They broke into the city, looting its ancient treasures and shattering the Roman continuity that had lasted since Augustus. The empire was eventually restored in 1261, but it was a ghost of its former self, a single city-state surrounded by the rising power of the Ottoman Turks. The end finally came on May 29, 1453. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II brought massive cannons to the walls of Constantinople, the same walls that had stood for 1,000 years. The last Roman emperor, Constantine XI, reportedly threw off his imperial regalia and died fighting in the streets as a common soldier. The fall of the city marked the definitive end of the Roman political story. But as the scholars of Constantinople fled to Italy, they carried with them the ancient Greek and Latin manuscripts that would ignite the Renaissance. The Roman Empire did not truly die. It dissolved into the foundations of the modern world. Every time we walk a straight road, consult a legal code, speak a Romance language, or look at a dome in a capital city, we are walking through the living ruins of the Roman mind. The story of Rome is more than a chronicle of fallen kings and marble ruins. It is the blueprint of the world we inhabit today. From a small cluster of huts on the Palatine Hill to a dominion that stretched across 3 continents, Rome taught us how to govern, how to build, and how to survive. It was a civilization forged in the fires of conflict and sustained by the iron will of its people. We saw the grit of the Republic face down Hannibal, the brilliance of Caesar bridge the Rhine, and the wisdom of Augustus craft a peace that lasted for centuries. Even as the West faded into the mists of the Middle Ages, the Roman heart continued to beat in Constantinople, preserving the light of antiquity for a future that was not yet born. Rome did not simply fall, it evolved. It lives on in the languages we speak, the laws that protect us, and the very architecture of our modern cities. To study Rome is to look into a mirror and see the heights of human achievement and the depths of our own frailty. The legions have long since marched into shadow, and the Forum is silent. But the legacy of the Eternal City remains, as a warning, a guide, and an eternal testament to the power of the human spirit. Roma invicta, Rome unconquered. And now, as we close this chapter of history together, I wish you a peaceful night. I hope you've had a restful sleep and that you wake up feeling as refreshed as the dawn over the 7 hills.
Good night, and may your dreams be as grand as the empires of old.